Okay, cool, you're awake. Okay, I would like to ask you actually all to close your eyes for a minute. And I want you to imagine that you are a 13-year-old girl who lives in rural India, and your dad is a farmer, and he's 2 lakh in debt. So he talks often about committing suicide. I want you to imagine that your mother is very ill and has been for many years. So it's your responsibility as a 13-year-old girl to take care of, cook, and clean for your 4 younger siblings. So at the age of 13, when your first marriage proposal comes along, your parents agree, thinking it's one less mouth to feed. You get married to somebody who's 35 and an alcoholic and cannot hold down a job. So by the time you're 16, you have 2 children, and it becomes your responsibility to take care of them. You end up doing domestic work in many different houses in your village in order to make ends meet. Eventually, your husband suggests, why don't you go to the city? Because there I've heard you'll make double the money that you make here, and we'll all live happily. So you trust him, you go with his friend to the city, and you take your 2 small children with you. And unbeknownst to you, this friend sells you to a brothel, where you're given a bed, and you're forced to sleep with 5 to 10 men a day, while your children sleep under the bed beneath you. Please open your eyes. Now, I have 3 questions for you guys. To put yourself in this woman's shoes. Let's say you're doing this job for about 1 year, sleeping with 5 to 10 men a day for 1 year. You have an opportunity to run away and try to become a domestic worker, but you don't know what kind of future that will hold or whether you'll be able to make ends meet, earning about 6,000 rupees a month. Or you can continue in sex work where you're earning about 10,000 rupees a month. Please raise your hand if you would go to domestic work. Take a chance, run away, and go to domestic work. Many of you. Okay, and how many of you would continue with sex work? Almost none. A couple. Okay, almost. All right, so now you're 18, and you become incredibly ill. You don't know what's wrong, so you go to the doctor, and it turns out you're HIV positive. You get both of your children tested, and it turns out one of your children is also HIV positive. Your costs now to run your household, educate your kids, take care of their medications, take care of your own health, cost about 12,000 rupees a month. I'd like to ask you again, how many of you would like to work as a domestic helper for about 8,000 a month? And how many of you would like to do sex work for about 10,000 a month? Raise your hand if you choose domestic work now. Very few. And raise your hand if you would choose sex work. Significantly more. Okay, eventually the last question I have for you is eventually somebody comes along from a nonprofit and says, I will take care of your kids, I will house them, feed them, educate them, but you have to give up your children and they have to live with me. This is probably the hardest decision that sex workers make in their lives. How many of you would send your children to an NGO to be taken care of by somebody else? Most of you. And how many would keep your kids at home with you? Very few. This is probably the most difficult decision sex workers make. So, my name is Robin. I run one of these NGOs. It's called Kranti, and Kranti empowers girls from Mumbai's red light areas to become agents of social change. We currently work with 16 girls who are ages 13 to 21, who are all survivors of trafficking, daughters of sex workers, or girls who are born and raised in the red light area. Now, the story that I just shared with you is a true story, and every single one of our girls or their moms were trafficked to Mumbai between the ages of 9 and 16. So many of them started doing sex work at the age of 9, 10, 11. Now, believe it or not, this is not a story about pity, it's not a story about sadness, it's not a story about how the world has come to an end. It is actually a story about happiness. And you're probably wondering how on earth an officer from the US Air Force ended up working in the red light area. So I actually began my journey seeking happiness very, very, very young. Now the reason was because I grew up in a household where I was in America, the land of the free and everything is supposed to be perfect, right? But I grew up in a home that was full of, both of my parents had mental illnesses. My mother had schizophrenia and my father had bipolar. And all of my childhood memories are about domestic abuse, of violence within the home. And I also realized at a very young age, 11 or 12, that I'm lesbian. So basically I spent my entire childhood with facing so many barriers and never knowing what to do, but also constantly wondering, what is the purpose of life? And eventually, I was a very good Indian girl and, I went through all of those motions that you're supposed to go through to find happiness, or according to Indian parents at least, right? You have to get very good scores in school, right? Where is that going to lead you? It's going to lead you to a good college. How does that help? Well, a good college will lead you to a good job, and a good job will lead you to a nice house, and a nice house will lead you to many cars, and eventually you'll be happy, right? So I followed that path, and I ended up in the U.S. Air Force, where I was a communications officer for 7 years. And eventually, there was a law in the U.S. military at the time called Don't Ask, Don't Tell, which meant you can't be gay or lesbian and serve openly. So I was actually the only Indian in the history of the military to be kicked out under this law, Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And I realized, you know what? I have a car, and I have a house, and I have lots of money, but I'm not happy. And eventually that search for happiness took me quite far to these 100 countries, as he mentioned, searching for what makes people happy. No matter what situation you come from, is there an equation that makes us happy? And eventually I ended up volunteering in a lot of nonprofits and made my way to India, where I met several people and decided to start Kranti, this NGO. And this NGO basically has shown me the path to happiness. And I think a lot of times people talk about how, wow, you've sacrificed so much, you've given up so much to be here. But the fact of the matter is, it's these girls and this program that has given me so much. And, you know, with happiness, I think that one of the really difficult things is sometimes you can be really rich and you can have all the money in the world and not be happy. And yet you can be a sex worker, probably on the streets, living on the streets, and still manage to be happy. So what is the equation? So when I started Kranti, I was asking a lot of these questions. And eventually you ended up working with a lot of people, a lot of girls who have mental health issues, who have depression, who are self-harming themselves, cutting themselves, trying to commit suicide, girls with a lot of different issues. And eventually this also brought me to meditation and yoga and all of these things. And I came to realize that, you know, happiness, I think, in so many ways is about living for something bigger than yourself, right? And that is something that Kranti has given me. And between all of these, you know, experiences, I'm not going to lie, there are times when, you know, you have to meet traffickers and convince them not to traffic people. There are times you have to stop girls from committing suicide. I've spent nights in jail being beaten up by the police. This stuff happens. And yet I would still honestly say I have the best job in the world, and I am probably one of the happiest, I live one of the happiest lives I can imagine possible. So eventually, we started, while we're working with these girls, as a teacher, particularly, I really started thinking about what is the point of education? I think that the purpose of life, I'm sure all of you would probably agree with me, is to seek and spread happiness, right? That is what we do everything for. That's why we come to TEDx. That's why we hang out with our friends. That's why we earn money, because we think these things are going to lead to happiness, right? So if that is the purpose of life, why is the purpose of education something different? Shouldn't education teach us and train us to be able to be happy? So instead of competition, why don't we teach about collaboration? Why don't we teach about compassion? How come nobody measures happiness or compassion or any of these things while we're in school? So while I'm working with these girls, I kind of realized, you know, we have some girls who are severe mental health problems, girls who have been trafficked at very young ages. We have girls who, you know, depression, all sorts of problems. We have a girl who's deaf in our house, so I speak a little bit of sign language as well. We have girls who are 17 and never gone to school, completely illiterate. How do you teach these girls collectively who are never going to be successful in a traditional sense? So instead of measuring how they do academically, I decided that we're going to measure happiness. So we've created a curriculum that really looks at all of those components. Everyone reads the Huffington Post, right? 10 ways to be happier. And yet all of those things, they keep repeating themselves, they're true. Gratitude, compassion, relationships, laughter. And we've tried to build a curriculum around creating happiness and working towards and striving for happiness rather than striving for money or jobs or, you know, the traditional sense of success. I'd just like to share 2 stories with you quickly. We have a couple girls. I mean, all of my girls to me are success stories. The situations that they've come from and the backgrounds that they've had, anything that they're doing in life to me is a success story. We have one girl who is 21. Her name is Shweta, and she's actually she's studying abroad in New York, and she became the first girl from an Indian red light area ever to study abroad. She came to us with this dream of, you know, mujhe America jana hai, and she had no concept of what America was, but just thought she wanted to go. So she studied, she took a couple gap years, she traveled quite a bit, doing a lot of volunteer work, eventually went abroad to study in New York. She received, for her volunteer work and her efforts to work with marginalized girls, she received an award from the United Nations, and has also received several awards in India. The second story I'd like to share is a girl named Pinky, who came to us 5 years ago, and she also had been sold off or married to somebody at the age of 9. And when she came to us, it was almost like talking to a wall. She wouldn't be able to articulate what was wrong, what she's feeling, anything. She's had 5 years of intensive therapy now. She used to harm herself and cut herself, burn herself, and this caused constant problems within the house. Some girl's trying to stop her from burning herself. Somebody's trying to, these kind of problems. And this girl now has been in therapy for 5 years, has been on medication for 1.5 years. To me, the measure of success is that she has not harmed herself for over 1 year now. And I think that, when many people have already spoken about education and how we're driving our children to these crazy, crazy measures of success, which sometimes aren't necessarily possible, but shouldn't be what we're measuring anyway. Who died and said, oh, I should have worked a few more hours last week? Nobody, right? Whenever we die, we think about all the people that we should have spent more time with, all the people we should have forgiven, all the people we should have had more compassion for, the people we should have asked to be forgiven for, right? So, I'm actually privileged enough to have with me probably the third story that I consider one of my biggest teachers in my life, the third success story of Kranti. Her name is Sheetal Jain, and she is 22 yesterday. She just turned 22 yesterday. And I can't explain to you what this girl has taught me about success and about happiness. So here she is to share her story, Sheetal Jain.
जब मैं छोटी थी ना तो हर समय पे मुझे मेरी माँ को ना तैयार होते हुए बहुत देखना अच्छा लगता था. कभी कभी मैं उनको मदद भी करती थी तैयार होने में. हमारे यहाँ शाम के समय पे हर औरतें लोग तैयार होकर टैक्सी के सामने खड़ी हो जाती थी, पर मेरी मम्मी वो तो टैक्सी में बैठ के चली जाती थी. कहाँ जाती थी, क्यों जाती थी, उस टाइम पे मुझे पता नहीं था. पर जब मैं बड़ी हुई तब मुझे पता चला कि मेरी माँ एक बार डांसर है. हाँ, मैं एक बार डांसर की बेटी हूँ. मैं शीतल जैन, कमाथीपुरा, मुंबई से. जब मैं छोटी थी तब मुझे हमेशा लोग बोलते थे कि तेरी माँ बार डांसर है तो तू भी बड़ी होकर बार डांसर ही बनेगी. पर मुझे कभी बार डांसर नहीं बनना था, और ना ही मेरी मम्मी चाहती थी कि कभी मैं बार डांसर बनूं. मुझे मेरी मम्मी के काम से कोई प्रॉब्लम नहीं था. बस बचपन में एक ही बात की बहुत खनकती थी वो बात मुझे, कि हर शाम को मेरी मम्मी एक नए आदमी को घर पे लेके आ जाती थी, और उन्हीं में से एक आदमी मेरी माँ का बिना शादी किया हुआ पति बन गया और मेरे भाई का पिता, और उसी ने मेरा सेक्सुअल अब्यूज किया था. जब वो आदमी मेरे साथ करता था तब मुझे कुछ समझता नहीं था कि एग्जैक्टली वो क्या कर रहा है, क्योंकि मैंने उनको पप्पा माना था और मुझे लगता था पप्पा का प्यार करने का तरीका ही है. बट मुझे समझता नहीं था कि वो उससे मुझे क्यों हर्ट हो रहा है. पर बाद में जब मुझे थेरेपी मिला तब मुझे पता चला कि वो सिचुएशन में मेरे हाथ में था ही नहीं रोकना. उसमें मेरी कोई गलती नहीं थी, क्योंकि मैं हमेशा सोचती थी कि मुझे रोकना चाहिए था, मुझे पापा को बोलना चाहिए था कि एग्जैक्टली आप क्या कर रहे हो मेरे साथ. बट मैं बोल ही नहीं सकती थी, क्योंकि मुझे लगता था पापा प्यार कर रहे हैं, ये प्यार करने का तरीका है उनका. पर बाद में मुझे रियलाइज हुआ थेरेपी होने के बाद कि नहीं, उसमें मेरी कोई गलती नहीं थी और मुझे लेट गो करना चाहिए, उनको माफ करना चाहिए. जिंदगी भर अगर मैं वो बात को लेके बैठूंगी तो मुझे नुकसान होने वाला है, मेरे बॉडी पे इफेक्ट होने वाला है. उनको कुछ होने वाला नहीं है. उनको जो करना था वो कर लिया उन्होंने. मेरी बचपन से पढ़ाई लिखाई सही से नहीं हुई है. मैं 4वीं में, 7वीं में, 10वीं और 12वीं तक ही पढ़ी हूँ. मैं अलग अलग एनजीओज में रही हूँ. बचपन में एक एनजीओ में थी जहाँ पे किसी भी लड़के को देखना अलाउड नहीं था या किसी से बात करना अलाउड नहीं था. पर उसी टाइम पे जैसे टीनेजर का बॉयफ्रेंड होता है, मेरा भी एक बॉयफ्रेंड था जो मुझे पसंद करता था. और जब हॉस्टल में पता चला कि मुझे एक लड़का पसंद करता है तो उन लोग ने मुझे 10वीं से निकाल के घर में बैठा दिया. मेरे लिए 10वीं में रहना बहुत बड़ी बात थी, क्योंकि मैं कभी पढ़ाई लिखाई सही से की नहीं हूँ और स्कूल जाना रेगुलर आप लोग की तरह तो मेरे लिए बहुत बड़ी बात थी. और तभी मैं वहाँ से निकल के क्रांति एनजीओ में आई. क्रांति जो डॉटर ऑफ सेक्स वर्कर के साथ काम करता है टू बिकम एजेंट ऑफ सोशल चेंज. तो मैं वहाँ पे 10th कर ही रही थी, और साथ ही साथ जब मैं आई थी क्रांति में तो मुझे पूछा गया कि तुमको कुछ सीखना है क्या, कुछ इंस्ट्रूमेंट सीखना है क्या, कुछ करना है क्या. मेरे लाइफ में पहला एक इंसान मिला था जो मुझे पूछा कि एग्जैक्टली तुझे करना क्या है बोल के. और तब मेरे माइंड में सिर्फ एक ही चीज आया, ड्रम्स, और कुछ नहीं. क्योंकि बचपन में मैं हमेशा गणपति विसर्जन में देखती थी कि आदमी लोग ढोल ताशा सब बजा रहे, और मैं कभी लड़की लोग को नहीं देखी थी. तो मुझे था कि मुझे सीखना है, बट कैसे सीखूंगी, कहाँ से, कुछ आइडिया नहीं था. तब मैं 10th कर ही रही थी और साथ ही साथ में मैं ड्रम क्लासेस जा रही थी, ड्रम किट. तो 3 महीना हो गया सीख रही थी, 6 महीना हो गया सीख रही थी. और जब मैं 10वीं में थी मुझे होमवर्क करके आन के होमवर्क करने बोलते थे। मैथ्स और साइंस मुझे कुछ पल्ले नहीं पड़ता था, कुछ भी नहीं, कुछ समझता नहीं था कि क्या है क्या नहीं। और बहुत रोती थी मैं कि सब लोग इतना अच्छे से पढ़ते हैं सब कुछ, और मैं एकदम अलग। बहुत स्कूल में बहुत डिस्क्रिमिनेशन होता था मेरे साथ। और तब मेरा 9 मंथ हो चुका था ड्रम किट सीखते हुए। तब मैं दी को बोली मुझे ये सब नहीं करना है, मेरे पल्ले नहीं पड़ने वाला और इससे मेरा फ्यूचर बनने वाला है ही नहीं, मैं नहीं देख सकती खुद को आगे। तब मैंने दीदी को बोला कि मुझे ड्रम किट में ही आगे बढ़ना है। तब हमने यूएस में अप्लाई किया था, वॉशिंगटन डीसी में। मुझे 1 साल के लिए स्कॉलरशिप मिला। मैं वहाँ पे 1 साल थी, ड्रम किट सीखी, परफॉर्मेंस किया था बैंड के साथ। और जब मैं लास्ट ईयर यूएस से वापस आ रही थी तो मुझे कुछ आइडिया नहीं था कि मैं एग्जैक्टली वापस आके क्या करूँगी, बैंड के साथ क्या करूँगी या क्या करना है, कुछ आइडिया नहीं था। तब रॉबिन ने मुझे एक ताल नाम की कंपनी से मिलाया जो जेम्बे इंस्ट्रूमेंट और अलग अलग जेम्बे, कॉन्गो, टैमोरिन सब अलग अलग इंस्ट्रूमेंट मिला के ड्रम सर्कल्स लेते हैं। तो उनके साथ मैं 1 साल का इंटर्नशिप करी और फिर ये साल में मेरा ट्रेनिंग खत्म हो गया और अभी मैं ड्रम सर्कल फैसिलिटेटर हूँ। तो मैं अलग अलग कम्युनिटी के साथ, एनजीओज के साथ और एनजीओज के साथ ड्रम सर्कल्स करती हूँ। और अब जब मैं सपने देखने लगी हूँ तो मेरा एक और सपना है कि मैं कमाथीपुरा में मेरी 2 फ्रेंड है, श्वेता कट्टी और कविता बोल के, जो क्रांति में, उनके साथ रेड लाइट एरिया में कैफे खोलूँ। जो अपॉर्चुनिटी हमें बचपन में मिली नहीं है वो अपॉर्चुनिटी उन बच्चे लोग को मिले। मेरा मानना है कि बहुत सारे लोग बोलते हैं कि तुम्हारा बैकग्राउंड बहुत वीक है, तुम बहुत कुछ झेली हो, तुम बहुत बिचारी टाइप में हो, तुम्हारा बैकग्राउंड बहुत वीक है। तो लेकिन मेरा मानना है कि मेरा बैकग्राउंड ही मेरा स्ट्रेंथ है, इसलिए मैं आज आप लोग के सामने खड़ी हूँ। मेरा मानना है कि मैं चाहती हूँ कि हमारे एरिया में सब बच्चे ये माने कि हमारा बैकग्राउंड ही हमारा वीकनेस नहीं है, और ये जो खुला आसमान है ये आप लोग का भी नहीं, ये हमारा भी है। थैंक यू सो मच। Thank you.